I am indeed Heather Arnold, local history librarian here at Cardinia Libraries. So we'll be talking today about hotels in 19th century Cardinia. And you can all see hotels in 19th century Cardinia? Right.
Yes.
Okay. So there were more hotels in the 19th century than there are today. Probably because the reason obviously was because travel distances and the need to refresh both humans and horses. So the trip from Dandenong to Bunyip or Dandenong to Lang Lang, for instance, was about 30 miles, 50 kilometres. And before trains and cars, even with a really fast coach like a Cobb and Co coach, it still took about 4 hours because the journey, they could still only go 6 to 8 miles per hour. So of course the horses had to be refreshed at every 10 to 30 miles, and this was done at hotels. And hotels, of course, were also required for accommodation, as well as the fact that they were watering holes for humans and for horses. So we'll look at some of the hotels in the area. This hotel on the screen is the Berwick Inn, the Border Hotel in High Street, Berwick, and still there today. So I'm always surprised at the number of female hotel keepers. Hotel keeping seemed to be a very equal opportunity occupation. And often women often had hotels in their own right, or they sometimes had them with their husband. So in Berwick, for instance, this is the Bain family. So they own the Border Hotel, the Berwick Inn. And Susan Bain, this is Susan Bain in the centre. Her husband, Robert Bain, who's on the right, as we look at the screen at the top, he started the Berwick Hotel in High Street in 1857, 2 years before he married his wife, Susan Stewart. And the Berwick Hotel is actually the oldest hotel and one of the oldest buildings still left in Cardinia today. So Robert and Susan married in 1859, and then she spent the next 20 years producing 11 children, all of which, except 3, predeceased her. 2 died under the age of 2, and 2 sons died in January 1908 due to a heat wave. Robert Bain himself was a very civic-minded person. He was involved in, he was a postmaster, the first secretary of the Berwick Roads Board. He was on the board of the Berwick State School, and the hotel was the venue for the first police court in 1865. And the Bains later donated the land on which the Berwick Mechanics Institute, if you know that, that still stands. So this is what the hotel looked like a year after it was built in 1858, very early photograph of Berwick. And it was just a single-storey building. And as in the 1870s and 1880s, there were 2-storey extensions, which you can see in this more modern photo. So Robert Bain, of course, gets a lot of credit for his public role in Berwick, but behind the scenes, of course, was Susan looking after all their children and also running the hotel. So when Robert died in 1887 at the age of 56, Susan Bain was only 48 and her youngest child was 8 years old, but she took over running the hotel and she ran it from 1887 till when she died in 1908. So she was a remarkable woman, I would have thought. And when she died, the South Berwick and Mornington Journal said she was highly respected and that her many good deeds will long be remembered by residents in and around Berwick. So she's our first woman, Susan Bain. And then another female hotel keeper was Catherine Burke. So this is Burke's Hotel, or the Trobe Inn in Pakenham, on the corner of the highway and Toomac Valley Road, or the Toomac Creek at Pakenham. Some of the hotels still there, I believe. It's been rebuilt recently, and apparently the original chimney still remains, but there's very little of the original building that is still there. So it was built around 1850. So Catherine and Michael Burke had arrived in Pakenham in 1843, and they took up Minton's Run, which was 2,800 acres on the Toomac Creek. They then built the hotel a few years later, and this was regarded as a hostelry of high repute and had good accommodation. So Michael and Kitty, as she was called, operated the hotel and the post office together until Michael died in 1877, and then Catherine continued to operate both businesses, and then later on with the help of her daughter Celia, and then Catherine died in 1910. And Catherine Burke as well as operating the hotel, and of course running the farm and everything else, she had 14 children born between 1839 and 1864. So a very busy woman. And the Burkes, of course, if you know anything about Pakenham, the Burke family has played a pivotal role in the development of Pakenham. They've been councillors, they've been football players, and Pakenham Racecourse was started by David Burke, who owned the Gembrook Hotel. We'll talk about him later. So, yeah, they've been very involved in all sporting activities and council activities in Pakenham for generations. Now, this is the Gippsland Hotel. I'll just show you what it looks like today. So you may, of course, know the Central Hotel in Berwick, in Beaconsfield, sorry. And it started, or scheme, as the Gippsland Hotel. And it was also operated by a woman, Janet Bowman. So her and her husband, David and Janet Bowman, had taken up the Panty Goon run on the Cardinia Creek in 1853. And they had 8 children by this time, all born between 1830 and 1850. So they took up the hotel in around 1853. Then David died in 1860, and Janet continued on with the hotel in her own right for a few years. So Janet Bowman's main claim to fame, and you may have heard of this, is Bowman's Track. So in 1861-62, Janet Bowman paid to have a 50-mile track cut from her hotel to the Hughes Creek, which went to the Jordan Goldfields, which was near Woods Point in Gippsland. The track was said to have cost £1,500. Some people said that Mrs. Bowman cut the track so miners would go past her door. However, she maintained that she did it because the government had announced that it would compensate people who provided tracks to the goldfields. After much fighting in 1878, the government awarded her something like £300 for her efforts in cutting the track. So she wrote a letter. She wasn't very happy about this, naturally, saying at the cost of £1,500, and they only gave her £300. And she wrote a letter to the editor of The Age in November 1877, and she said, "You readily understand the expensive means and firm determination were required to accomplish a work the magnitude of which would have deterred most people from even attempting. The benefits at the time from the track were immense, and more recently, the advantage to selectors has been appreciated by the energetic body of men." So Mrs. Bowman, well, that's the Gippsland Hotel, I laid a photograph. And this is Mrs. Bowman here, a formidable looking woman. Mrs. Bowman was described as enterprising, courageous, and a devout Presbyterian, more of which later. And she died in 1904, aged 93, having outlived 6 of her 8 children. So the Beaconsfield Hotel, or the Central Hotel, has a claim to fame because the Duke of Edinburgh, who was the Queen Victoria's son, he visited there in 1869 and stayed at the hotel for a number of days and did a bit of shooting and fishing and whatever else happened, all the sporting activities around Beaconsfield at the time. So the inn was staffed by members of his crew from the ship, the HMS Galatea, and the government had actually built 2 extra rooms onto the hotel to accommodate the Prince and his entourage. So the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Alfred, was the second son of Queen Victoria and her husband, Prince Albert, and had the distinction of undertaking the first ever royal tour of Australia from October 1867 to June 1868. And during this first tour, he was there was an attempted assassination against him in Sydney in March 1868, and he wasn't injured, but the man who shot him, Henry James O'Farrell, was an Irish man. He was also, so I think there was some sort of sectarian issue, but he was also an alcoholic and had like mental issues. And apparently the Duke said that his life should be spared, but he was actually hung for the attempted assassination of the Prince. So, and then the Duke came back 2 years later on a private visit, and that's when he stayed at the Beaconsfield Hotel. In 1874, he married the Grand Duchess Marie of Russia, the daughter of Tsar Alexander II. And in honour of his marriage, an English bakery made the Marie biscuit, or the Marie biscuit, that we still have today. So that was in honour of the marriage of the Prince to a Grand Duchess. And I've said this before in my talks, but if I was a Grand Duchess, I would expect a better biscuit than a Marie biscuit. I would expect something like an iced Bovo or something like that, or a chocolate royale, something with icing and, you know, all these other things. But she got the Marie biscuit. So next time you make hedgehog or you make lemon slice, you can think of the Grand Duchess and the Prince and his time at the Beaconsfield Hotel. And this, as I said before, is what it looks like today. So this was built about 1928. It's quite a nice looking building, very Mediterranean style. Another interesting female publican was Sarah Fagan. So Mrs. Fagan, she started a hotel in 1857 on Lyndhurst Hill. So it's on the South Gippsland Highway. If any of you know where the old ABC radio station was, or there are two big antennas on the corner of the South Gippsland Highway and Hallam Road. So it was like a triangular block. So this is where she had her hotel. So Mrs. Fagan was the victim of a shipwreck, and she'd come out on the Charlemont from Northern Ireland, and it went down off Point Henry in 1853, and she lost everything, even though all passengers were saved. She joined her husband and other family members in Victoria, and just after she arrived, her husband died, and then she decided to open this hotel. Sarah had 6 children, 5 of whom came to Australia. I had written about Mrs. Fagan on a blog that I have, Casey Cardinia, links to our past, and I'd written that, you know, she was a hotel keeper. But anyway, her great-grandson, Dr. Noel Gunston, who's a historian, he's written the book called The Good Country, Cranbourne, Shire. So he's quite an authoritative historian. He's also her great-grandson. And he sent me an email saying he was intrigued and amused that I had promoted Sarah to hotel keeper, as he always assumed she must have kept what was called a shanty and had no proper licence. And he also said, I expect the Cobb & Co coaches changed horses there and travellers were able to get a snack, as she was famous for her savoury delicacies. And the drivers and those in the know were given something strong to drink. So that's Mrs. Fagan. I sort of like Mrs. Fagan. She's another formidable looking woman, but I just like the whole idea that, you know, she came to Australia. I mean, I admire all migrants who come to Australia who leave their family behind, leave their country behind, and you just think, you know, to start a new life for themselves and their family. I think it's a really brave thing to do. So, you know, I admire women like them and like Sarah Fagan. So there's also another female publican who was also a victim of a shipwreck, and that was Mrs. Gooch. So this is Mrs. Gooch and her husband Thomas, and they had the Mornington Hotel in Cranbourne, which is where Kelly's Hotel is today. And Mrs. Gooch and her husband and Thomas. So Thomas was they were on the Sacramento. That was the ship, and Thomas was a sailor on the Sacramento. Mrs. Gooch, or she was Miss Minister, as she was then, she was a passenger, and they were wrecked off the heads at Port Phillip Bay, and they lost all their possessions, but they found true love and married each other in 1853. So she then produced 9 children in the next 12 years, and they also had the hotel, this hotel here at Cranbourne. It's in High Street, Cranbourne. So I just think it's interesting that both, and I suppose, you know, shipwrecks are so common, and interesting the 2 of our female publicans were both victims of shipwrecks. And now we'll go into hotels at Pakenham. So there were originally 3 hotels in Pakenham. There was Burke's Hotel, which we've spoken about. That was the one opened by Michael and Kitty Burke. Then there was the Gembrook Hotel, which is on the railway, near the railway line. It's still there. It's a new, it looks like this today. And that was built about 1929. But the Gembrook Hotel was started in around 1877, the same time the railway station at Pakenham was opened. And that was opened by David Burke, who was the nephew of Michael and Kitty Burke. So that was the second hotel. And there was another hotel in Pakenham, which was Fraser's Hotel. So it was on the corner of, I don't know if you can see, it was on the Tumac Creek, or Minton's Creek, as they say here, on the right-hand side is Berwick's Hotel, you can see here. And on the left-hand side, somewhere near the highway, was Fraser's Hotel. If you know Pakenham at all, it's where the Mr. Furniture shop is now located. So Eliza and Alexander Fraser, so they were the owners of this hotel, and we can find out something about the Frasers because they had a licence renewal hearing that took place in January 1883, and it was reported in the papers. So Mrs. Fraser had applied for the renewal of her licence for her hotel and her billiard table. This was opposed by the police on the grounds that she kept a disorderly house. Police Sergeant McWilliams said he had seen drunken men lying about the grounds and the buildings were in a very dilapidated condition, in fact, in a most disgusting and beastly state. McWilliams also made comments about her husband, Alexander. He said Eliza had complained to him, the policeman, that at one time her husband had tried to kill her and she had to take out a summons against him, binding her husband to keep the peace. On another occasion, McWilliams reported there was a drunken man lying outside the hotel covered with blood, apparently having been in a fight. Mrs. Fraser intervened, and when Mr. Fraser kicked her and gave her a blow to the face. So this poor woman who owned a hotel, she was sort of stuck in the hotel with her violent husband, and then she had her own barrister to defend her at this hearing, and her barrister said that that the only issue that was relevant was her unsatisfactory marital relations with her husband, which was not misconduct on her part, but her misfortune, for which she should not be deprived of her only source of livelihood and thrown upon the world with only a few sticks of furniture to sell to enable her to commence life afresh. He added that Mrs. Fraser was dependent upon the hotel to support herself and her children, and that she'd been a publican for 13 years, 11 years in Melbourne. So eventually the court allowed her to keep her licence, but for some reason did not allow her to keep her billiard table licence. So that just seemed weird to me. But anyway, that's what happened. So I just think it's interesting. I don't know what happened to her husband in the end, but she died in, Eliza Fraser died in 1890, age 43. And by then, according to her will, she'd actually owned the hotel outright because she left that to her sons. And she also owned a block of land near the railway station in Pakenham. So she'd obviously done quite well for herself in spite of her husband who seemed to be a very violent man. So, you know, you have to admire her for that. And I think it tells you that how much, or it tells you two things about that thing, that sometimes, you know, publicans reapply for their licenses and police often, I believe, made trumped up charges against the licensee, especially the women, because perhaps they hadn't, you know, given them any favours. And also the perilous state that women had in those days without the supporting parents benefit and without any sort of help from the government. If their husband was violent or their husband had left them, there's really, you know, they really had to make their own life and rely on their own earnings because they couldn't survive any other way. So, and of course, being in a hotel, it also gave women a source of income and also a place to live and to raise their family. So of all these women, such as Susan Bain, Janet Bowman, Kitty Burke and Elizabeth Gooch, Sarah Fagan, etc., as far as I'm concerned, their achievements are even more remarkable with the fact that they not only ran a hotel, but they also produced, you know, child after child after child. And with all the inherent risks of childbirth in those days, because in the 18, this is a infant mortality chart here, and in the 18, let me just see here, around the time, like the 1800s, the maternal mortality rate was 5 mothers would die for every 1,000 live births. So that's quite a high mortality rate. And if you produce a baby, of the little babies, an average of 120 babies under the age of 1 would die out of every 1,000 born. So not only was there a risk to the mother to have children, but there was also a likelihood that their child would not survive. So, you know, it was a very risky business being a woman in those days. So any woman who survived and did well, you have to admire them. That's what I think. And now, religion. So we mentioned before that Mrs. Bowman was a Presbyterian, and traditionally hotel keepers are usually seen as being Irish and Catholic. But in the 1850s and 1860s, it was not unusual to have Protestants such as Sarah Fagan and Janet Bowman operating hotels. By the 1880s, there was the movement towards abstinence from alcohol, or the temperance movement, and many of the Protestant churches promoted abstinence. So Dr. Gunston, who I mentioned before, who's the Cranbourne Shire historian, he wrote that the Gooches, the Tuckers and the Duffs own the Cranbourne Hotel, which is also, of course, in Cranbourne, and Mrs. Bowman of the Gippsland Hotel were perhaps the last of their kind to combine evangelical piety with the publican's profession. So we've looked at some of the women who owned hotels, and now we're going to look at some of the names of hotels. So, of course, the common names of hotels in Australia are the Railway Hotel, Royal Hotels and Commercial Hotels. So if for some reason we don't have a commercial hotel anywhere in Cardinia, but we do have a Railway Hotel and we do have a Royal Hotel. So this here is a Railway Hotel in Bunyip, which was established somewhere around 1877. So the railway line that went through to Sale was built in stages, and then it and from October 1877 to March 1878, the terminus of the railway line was actually Bunyip, and that's, I presume, why the hotel was called the Bunyip Railway Hotel. And there was various hotels built in Bunyip because obviously they had to accommodate the workers and accommodate the locals, and also meant the people who arrived on the train from Bunyip then had to change over from a coach to continue on their journey. So the Railway Hotel was opened around 1877. It's here on the left here, and from 1890, Thomas Stacey was the publican, who was described as being genial and a man with a keen interest in local affairs, and he also owned the Bunyip Racecourse. The original building was destroyed by fire in 1924, and the new building, which is the existing building, you may know this if you know Bunyip, was built in the same year, 1924, a much grander edifice than the original one. So it's a Railway Hotel. Another popular name of a hotel is, of course, the Royal Hotel. There are 242 Royal Hotels in Australia, apparently, and the Royal Hotel in Koo Wee Rup was built in 1915 and still operates, still virtually the same. It was opened by Dennis McNamara and constructed by Mr. Oliver for the contract price of nearly £3,500. And when it was finished, it was described as a fine, commodious building of nearly 30 rooms and one of the finest edifices of its kind in Gippsland. And it was fitted out by Mr. McKee of the Royal Arcade in a most up-to-date and luxurious manner. So it is a good-looking hotel. It's interesting, of course, because, it provided accommodation, it provided, meals and everything else. But this is a good-looking. Even the heritage study, which is done by Graham Butler and Associates in 1996, described this as one of the, I think I'm right here, one of the best-looking hotels in Gippsland, and it really is a wonderful-looking hotel. Related, of course, to the Royal Hotel is a Palace Hotel. So we have a Palace Hotel in Lang Lang. It started life as a coffee palace. So as you would know, of course, with the establishment of the temperance movement, a lot of coffee palaces were established to provide an alcohol-free environment where you could do all the things you could do in a hotel, like have meals, have accommodation, but with no alcohol involved. So the Lang Lang Coffee Palace was built near the railway station, which is sort of a bit further north than what it is than what the current hotel is now. And it was burnt down in May 1933, and the new Palace Hotel was opened on the existing site in June 1934. So in this photograph here, the building on the top right-hand side is the existing Palace Hotel, which is on the corner of Western Port Road and McDonald's Track. So it's a Palace Hotel. some of the common hotel names are related to land administration areas. So we here in Cardinia are part of the county of Mornington. So land administration in Victoria was divided into counties. Each county was divided into parishes. So the Pakenham, for instance, is half in the parish of Goon, half in the parish of Pakenham. But basically, there was a Mornington Hotel. We saw it at the one owned by sorry, I'm just looking at this. The Mornington owned by the Gooches, yes, at Cranbourne. So that was Mornington, one of the early Mornington hotels, and named because of the county of Mornington. And there was another Mornington Hotel, which was in Narre Warren. So it was in 1852. Thomas and Eliza Walton arrived at Narre Warren and built Holly Green. So that's where the Fanagate Shopping Centre is now. And they had like quite a lot of acres, and he had quite a big farm there. But he also built a hotel on the property, which was called the Mornington Hotel. And that was in about 1855. And it was kept by John Gardner and later by John Payne. And it was on the northeast corner of the Gippsland Road and the Narre Warren North Road, where the recreation reserve is, or used to be, if you know that, where the old Narre Warren Recreation Reserve was. It was demolished around 1882 by Sydney Webb. So I haven't got a photo of it, sadly. And then, of course, the other Mornington Hotel was the one owned by the Gooches, which is now. So the Mornington Hotel changed its name in 1911 to the Motor Club Hotel. And they think it's probably because either they say the Royal Automobile Club of Victoria, the RACV, apparently started on a trip where some motoring enthusiasts had a trip to Tooradin, which is just past Cranbourne, and they decided there that they would start the RACV, or an automobile club, which became the RACV. So they think that may be the reason why the Motor Club Hotel was called that. But then it was taken over by the Kelly family in 1919, and of course now is pretty much universally known as Kelly's Hotel, but is technically the Motor Club Hotel at Cranbourne, and was, of course, previously known as the Mornington Hotel. The Gippsland Hotel. So there's been two Gippsland hotels. Mrs. Bowman's Hotel was often known as the Gippsland Hotel, or later on the Central Hotel. And the Gippsland Hotel, you can see here on the right, was started in another Bunyip Hotel, started in the 1880s by Lawrence Finch. His daughter Sarah then took over, and she ran the hotel in her own right, Sarah Finch, and then she married Mr. Kraft, and then for some reason was always known as Kraft's Hotel. This hotel was destroyed by fire in around 1927, and there's a new building built, which I don't have a photo of, but the new building, if you know Bunyip at all, is known as the Top Pub. So that was another female-run hotel for quite a while. And the Gippsland Hotel. Other interesting hotel names is the Bush Inn, which is a Cardinia Park Hotel. So the Cardinia Park Hotel's just north of Beaconsfield, and that was opened in the 1870s. The Rangers Hotel in Gembrook was opened around the time the Puff and Billy arrived, which was the Puff and Billy Railway arrived, which is about 1900 it was. So it was built near the Gembrook Railway Station, called the Rangers Hotel for the obvious reason that it was in the Dandenong Ranges. It was the second oldest hotel in Cardinia until it burnt to the ground on September the 24th, 2018, which is still very sad. I don't think it's been rebuilt, but you know, it's sad when historic buildings, especially a hotel, which is a sort of the lifeblood of a community in some ways, it's very sad when they burn down. There's been two halfway houses hotels in Cardinia. So this is Taylor's Halfway House, which is in Lyndhurst, on halfway between Dandenong and Cranbourne, and it was operated by Richard Taylor, and he built this hotel with clay dug from a pit on his property and made all the bricks by hand and built the hotel himself. It was eventually demolished in 1966. Richard had arrived in Victoria in 1854 and worked on the gold diggings. His wife, Sidonia, and his children, Elizabeth and Charles, arrived later in 1857, 3 years later. Another 3 children were born in Victoria. They were Richard II, George, and Walter. And the family, sadly, is an example of the high mortality rate and the maternal mortality rate of Victorian era. So their first child, little Charles, he died the year he arrived in Victoria. Another little son, Richard, died at 3 years old. And another son, little Walter, died at 1 year old. And their mother, Sidonia, died the same year she gave birth to Walter. So it was really quite a sad, it's just a sad thing to think that, you have 5 children, 3 of them die as little babies, and then the mother dies. But that was the reality of life in those days. So that was Richard Taylor, who owned the Lyndhurst Hotel. And there's this other halfway house hotel at Pakenham, which I presume is, it was near Aberhart Road at Pakenham. And I presume it's halfway house because it's halfway between Pakenham and Goon, I guess. I don't know what else is halfway between. It was built in 1863 by David Connor and delicensed 1899 and became a private house. And it's now actually at the Moe Folk Museum. So you can go and see it there. The Moe Folk Museum, or Gippsland Folk Museum, collected a whole lot of old buildings from around Gippsland and established a little historic park at Moe. Now, I'm going to show you some what I think are interesting stories about hotels. So the Hallam Hotel. So there's a rumour. The rumour is that Squizzy Taylor used to visit the Hallam Hotel to see his sister, Mrs. Buffett, who was a licensee of the hotel. So I've heard lots of rumours about Squizzy Taylor. In my time, I used to work down in the City of Melbourne Libraries, and if I had, $1 for every person who said, my grandma said that Squizzy Taylor lived in this house. Like, he must have lived in a million houses around Fitzroy and Collingwood. He may well have lived in them all, but I sometimes feel that there's a lot of myth and legend surrounding Squizzy Taylor and not much truth. But anyway, so there is a rumour or a myth that, or a thinking that Squizzy Taylor visited his sister in the Hallam Hotel. So Mrs. Buffett, Elsie Buffett, she took over the licensee of the hotel in July 1927, and Squizzy Taylor died in October 1927. So if he did visit her at the hotel, it was only between July and October 1927 because she had been somewhere else beforehand. And then she certainly was not his sister because he was the son of Benjamin Isaiah Taylor and Rose Jones, and he was born in somewhere in Melbourne, but she was born in Corowa in New South Wales, and she was the daughter of Dougal MacDonald and Maria Green. So clearly, they were not brother and sister. And she married George William Buffett in 1916. It wasn't a particularly happy marriage because in 1937, she was granted a divorce from her husband on the grounds of desertion. So she held the hotel license at Hallam from July 1927 until October 1933. And then she moved to other hotels, including Collabidabin, and then eventually she moved to Red Cliffs near Mildura, and that's where she died. So the myth is that Squizzy Taylor visited his sister at the Hallam Hotel, and he may well have visited the Hallam Hotel, but she was not his sister. So I don't know. This is a story about the Pig and Whistle Hotel on Cannibal Creek. So this is north of Garfield. So Garfield used to be called Cannibal Creek. It's now, of course, called Garfield. And it was there was a hotel you can see here on my little map called the Pig and Whistle Inn, and it was on the old route of the Gippsland Road, which you can see what they call the old Telegraph Road. It went through to Alice Road and eventually to cross over and down to Gippsland that way. So he had a hotel there on the Cannibal Creek, or more of a shanty on the Cannibal Creek, which he'd opened up in 1866. He was so Jabez James, Jabez James was granted the license. However, a year later, he was declared insolvent due to the falling off of business in consequence of the government changing the line of road between Cannibal and Shady Creeks. And what happened was they then put a new road in south of his property, and so there wasn't as much passing traffic. He had debts of £192. So 3 years later, Jabez James was back in the news because he was charged with deserting his de facto, Mary Ann Goldsmith, with whom he had 5 children, and leaving her and the children without support. He was ordered to pay support and put up a surety of £20. And the report in the newspaper said that as Jabez James had neither money nor friends to assist him, he was sent to jail. So it wasn't a very happy life. In the end, Mary Ann, his wife, she died quite young, still had 5 young children. She died in the North Melbourne Benevolent Society Asylum. So it was just quite a sad life. I don't know what happened to the children, but I don't know what happened to him either. But, you know, it's just sort of a sad life all around, I would have thought, for the whole family out there. The next licensee of the Pig and Whistle Hotel was Kathleen Leeson, and she lived to 100 years old, so she did very well there. So, you know, it's just an interesting place. I don't think there's any signs of any signs of the building anymore out there in North Garfield. And there was another hotel in Garfield called the Iona Hotel, which was built in 1904, burnt down in 1914, and a new building opened in 1915. So this is the Sherwood Hotel. So the Sherwood Hotel is on the corner of South Gippsland Highway and the Tooradin Tyre Road, and it was built around 1870. So the people we're concerned about here are the Poole brothers. So Frederick, George and Thomas Poole were early settlers in the Cranbourne area. They were on the road, they were on the council, they were on, you know, doing own big farms on the Shire, Cranbourne Shire Council and things like that. And George Poole was a bootmaker in Cranbourne, and he was elected Shire president as well. And he purchased the Sherwood Hotel in around 1877. So, but we know about George Poole because there was in the 1880, 1889, there was a series of articles published in the paper about Tooradin, and it was more like a thing to encourage people to go down and buy land there. So it was like a tourism thing. So it was written by Hawkeye, and it was describing all the grand things that you could do around Tooradin. And they described George Poole, who ran the Sherwood Hotel, as a fine specimen of a true Saxon, big of limb, deep of chest, clear-eyed, strong and powerful throughout. He reminds you more of the days when there were giants in the land than of a prosperous publican. He'd visited America, and when he returned, he decided he wanted to. He returned to England, and he opened a bar, an American bar, where you could visit, where you could obtain a mint julep and a cocktail. He then went to Australia, but Hawkeye said that when he moved to Australia, he decided he'd settle down to be the life of a farmer, and then he built this hotel. He bought this hotel here. The ground of the Sherwood Hotel had a large stable and a milking shed, and the Pooles milked 40 cows. And the article that was describing George Poole said that Mrs. Poole was the most obliging and attentive hostess, and that she makes beautiful butter. So I had assumed, of course, that Mrs. Poole was his wife, Anne, who is Anne Seymour, and to whom he had 3 children. And then, so he had the 3 children born 1865 to 1870. But turns out that actually Mrs. Poole was not his wife, but his girlfriend, lady friend, whatever you like to call her. Can't remember what they call her. But anyway, so George Poole had bought the hotel from John Strudwick, who had died. So he bought it from the widow. So he bought the hotel, and it seems like he also took over the widow as well, because he then took up with the widow, Mrs. Strudwick, Mary Strudwick, and had 4 children with her all the time whilst he was married to his first wife, Anne. So, his 4 children to her were born between when he was 54 and 68 years old. So it's just interesting. I don't know whether his first wife, Anne, or his existing wife, Anne, was humiliated to think that he would take up with another woman and have 4 children by her, or whether she was just, glad to be rid of him and lived her own life. I don't really know, but I think it's just interesting sort of just interesting the way it panned out in the end for them. So that was the Sherwood Hotel, which is now demolished, and that's was on the corner of South Gippsland Highway and Tooradin Tyab Road. One thing I found out about hotels is they often were places where postmortems were conducted, and so there's account after account of bodies being found. So this one here, a resident of Garfield was walking along a track on Thursday when he came across a dead body of a man. The policeman was called, and the remains were conveyed to the Iona Hotel at Garfield. The body was decomposed, and Dr. Cowan, who conducted the inquiry, was of the opinion the death took place about a month ago. Anyway, so identified him as Peter Lynch from Cork. But it's just interesting that, to think that any hotel keeper these days would want the decomposed body of any man or woman found in the bush returned to his hotel. And I presume hotels were used as a place to conduct an inquiry because there was space, and there was probably a table or a bed that they could put the body on, and there was also lots running water and things like that, and lights. But there's just account after account in the papers of bodies being found, and then an inquiry or post-mortem conducted at the local hotel. This one here is another one here. The inquiry was conducted at the Beaconsfield Hotel, or the Pinegrove Hotel, sorry, in Beaconsfield. And anyway, so that was one of the interesting lives that a publican had to face, interesting activities a publican had to face in those days. Oh, before I go into my last story, there's this story here. Oh, this one here. Anyway, so another issue that publicans had to face was the ever-present threat of young children or young men, usually drinking hotels, and then the publicans were charged with serving a minor or with underage drinking. So there was an article in the Bunyip and Garfield Express in October 1918, and they were prosecuting Edward Dreyer, who was the licensee of the Iona Hotel at Garfield, for serving 3 people under the age of 18 with liquor. One was Frederick Sippo, Hugh Murdoch, and Stephen McMillan. The first 2 boys were 16, and the last boy was 18 years old. So basically, the licensee was away on the day, and his wife, Mrs. Dreyer, had served these people. But the boys had been in the hotel before and said they were 18. So the charges were dismissed by the bench, as Dreyer had evidently put his foot down on the matter by taking every precaution. So the next time, the same article goes on to say the 3 boys then went to the Gippsland Hotel at Bunyip, and their licensee there was also charged with serving minors to underage people. And the licensee refused to serve 2 of them, but served another one of the boys. But the publican did not know that the boys were underage, and the charges were dismissed. And then, not content with then going to the 2 hotels, the boys as a party then went to a 3rd hotel, the Railway Hotel in Bunyip, and they were playing cards, and they bought a bottle of wine. But the licensee, Mr. Stacey, they decided that he really didn't serve the boys alcohol, and charges against him were dismissed. But of course, too many, they could actually lose their license if they were charged with serving underage drinkers. So I just think these boys, it's a bit of a funny story that they went on this pub crawl. And I don't know how they got from Garfield in those days to Bunyip, perhaps by horse, or they might have walked or something. But anyway, that was a occupational hazard of being a publican in those days. And finally, we'll talk about the Narnagoon Hotel. So the Narnagoon Hotel was built by Michael and Joanna O'Brien in 1883. So Michael O'Brien had also built the first general store in Narnagoon, and his parents were Daniel and Bridget O'Brien, who'd operated the Limerick Arms Hotel at Narnagoon. This is the Limerick Arms. So the Narnagoon Hotel, which is a photograph of it here, was, as I said, built by Michael and Joanna O'Brien. And in the 1970s, it was owned by Harry Kroll. And according to a website owned by his son, Harry worked with builders in renovating his hotel for several months and ordered a heating system from the Gas and Fuel Corporation, who installed gas central heating. The gas pipes leaked, and when the resident barman turned the cellar light off, having been looking for the source of the gas smell, the hotel blew up, and the bit in this photo totally disappeared with bits breaking windows over 300 metres away. So the hotel actually blew up on May the 21st, 1972. Apparently, there was a lot of publicity about it at the time. The owners renovated a small shed at the back and continued to serve, and apparently Graham Kennedy and other celebrities would make a special trip to visit the pub and stand around outside while other patrons drinking beer. And the new double-storey building, which is the existing Narnagoon Hotel, was built with a payout from the Gas and Fuel Corporation. So we've gone out with a bang, and that is my last slide. Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you for listening to us and participating. Thank you.